Just wanted to talk to you a little bit about something I've been interested in for a while. Hello, I just wanted to talk about stigma. Right up to my mouth, huh? This is weird. Okay, all right. So, uh, why does migraine have stigma attached to it? So what is stigma? Stigma is when society, people, laws are telling you that like you're less important or valuable because you have something like this. Okay. Holy cow, that's different. Okay. So stigma is when, you're being told by society, by our culture, that you're less important, less valuable, or there's something wrong with you because of a certain condition. And so, one of the things that we've discovered over the years, and I'm really proud I had one of the first papers about this, is that migraine is a stigmatized disease. So, I think that's really kind of interesting. Why should it be? Like, that's not right. And why is that a thing? So, I'm lucky that there have been some historians and sociologists who've been thinking about this problem. And, it turns out that in the history of time, the stigma of migraine is relatively new. And it seems like it started in the 1700s. And that's kind of a strange thing. Before that, like, everything about migraine was just treated like another disease. If you read a textbook, if you broke your leg, they'd be, what do you do about a broken leg? Or if you had a migraine, it was, what do you do about that? But there wasn't a sense that there was anything to be put down or there was anybody's fault if they had migraine disease. So in the 1700s, it shifted, and one of the earliest references I could see of this was an early poem by a guy called Alexander Pope in 1712. And the story, this was like a funny, really famous, and the guy was like a rock star for writing funny poems. And he talks about this woman, Belinda, and she's like protected from all the hardships in the world, especially for men. And Belinda, is sitting there, and this baron, this dastardly baron, like gets through all of her defenses by these magical creatures and cuts a lock of her hair. And Belinda's reaction, and this is like making fun of Belinda, it goes like this: here in a grotto, sheltered close from air, and screened in shades from day's detested glare, she sighs forever on her pensive bed, pain at her side and migraine in her head. That was in 1712. And so, she's like such a weak and fragile creature that like she's this blown away and incapacitated by having somebody cut a little piece of her hair. So there was another example of this kind of making fun of and belittling people with migraine. In the 1780s, there were these social events, and they were enormously, socially important to go to these masques, and you would dress up like all the rich and famous people, like a Hollywood Awards ceremony. All these rich and famous people would show up, and the guy who won the day was pretending to be, let me get this right, the Docteur de la Migraine, and he was like, making fun of the people with migraine and their doctors. So, this was just this example of how all of a sudden it changed. And so why did this shift come in understanding and how we as a society treated people with migraine. And this is what I think, and this is my speculation, that two things happened. One is, like, we didn't understand, in those days, in the 1700s, you were able to say, okay, like a broken leg is a thing, and a cancer is a thing, but people didn't have a way to say that migraine was such a thing. And so it was sort of mysterious. And in the age of reason, which was starting up back then, migraine didn't sit very well because people couldn't understand it because it was so much more complicated than another medical condition. And then the other thing is, people started to live in schedules and have to do schedules, and that really sucked for people with migraine because, if you did your job but you had a migraine and you rested and you got back and did your thing, that was fine before, but with industrialization, like, other people were dependent on you getting the job done on time. And if you had a migraine, it really inconvenienced them, and they sort of got pissed off about it. So that's what I think happened. But this has continued, and over the last 300 years, it hasn't gone away. And so, I think that there is a change afoot. Like, until about 10 years ago, until Miles for Migraine started to have its races, like, nobody was doing anything to undo the stigma of migraine. And stigma is really bad for people. And we with migraine get it. We get it from others who have migraine. Nobody who's here, of course, because everybody who's here by definition supports people with migraine. But you know what I mean. You get it from your family members. You get it at work. Like, why don't you take an Excedrin? Like, all these things that do not respect the journey that those with migraine are going through. All of that is one type of stigma. And then there's the stigma that comes from the rules and the laws. And that, too, is something that we see all the time. Like, why is it so unfairly difficult to get Social Security disability if you have chronic migraine? Like, it's horrendous, and society is making rules that are designed to go against people who have migraine disease and similar stigmatized disorders. That is the other kind of, that's called public stigma, that's so visible. But the worst kind of stigma is called internalized stigma, and that's the inevitable result of hearing these stigmatizing messages year and after year, as you go through with migraine disease. And people actually begin to believe this crap, and they they internalize these stigmatizing attitudes, and their internal conversations to themselves has this stigmatizing character, and that's internalized stigma. And for the doctors who are here, there's another kind of stigma, which is called courtesy stigma, that's a funny name because there's really not a lot of stigma, courtesy there. It's looking down on doctors for taking care of people with migraine, and thinking like, why don't you do something valuable and become an orthopedic surgeon or something like that? So that's courtesy stigma. You can compare stigma across diseases. So we can begin to tell how stigma stacks up for migraine as a disease compared to other diseases. And the way that's done is this wonderful scientist and sociologist looked at 4.5 million newspaper articles over about 45 years. And she looked at the paragraphs in which the word migraine was said and whether there were stigmatizing concepts in there. Let me get some of those stigmatizing concepts, like disgust, danger, impurity, negative personality traits, And it turns out that if you look at stigma, migraine is number 18 out of 107 diseases, and all of the ones that are worse than migraine are the psychiatric diseases, and also some of the sexually transmitted diseases are also more stigmatized. But there's, like most other diseases, are much more stigmatized. And of all the neurologic diseases, migraine is the most stigmatized. So this is a thing, and it can be measured, and it's pretty darn bad for people with migraine. And being stigmatized, is connected with having anxiety, depression, and even suicide. So, that's, it's important to recognize it and to address it, because it hurts you if you get stigmatized in really deep and in profound ways. It also, stigma has a very bad effect on resource allocation. So, of course, one resource might be understanding and kindness. And people who have stigmatized diseases obviously aren't getting a lot of that. But another way is resources like government money for disability. That's another good example. And there's the NIH funding. So let me give you, this is a little bit provocative, I'll be honest, but let's go through these thoughts together. So in terms of what disease impact is, migraine disease impact is just about exactly the same as Alzheimer's disease. So that's the burden. This is according to the World Health Organization, the Global Burden of Disease Study. And the percent of disability and death, of disability-adjusted life years, which is, let's call it impact, for Alzheimer's is 1.83% of all disease impact. And for migraine, it's like a couple percent worse, 1.86%. All right, so let's just call that the same, Alzheimer's and migraine, in terms of overall impact. And NIH spending for Alzheimer's, get ready for this, $3.059 billion. And NIH spending for migraine, this is in 2022, $46 million. So folks with migraine are getting shafted by the government, and that's a fact. What about willingness of people to donate to charities? All right, let's compare those. So I found these figures for what's the largest Alzheimer's group, and it's the Alzheimer's Association in 22 was 502 million. That's how much they got in charitable contributions. For migraine, it was the biggest organization. It was $2.6 million. So whatever that is, 200 times more for people with Alzheimer's than for people with migraine, even though disease burden is identical. So consider this. If you're a 60-year-old senator and who's making policy and writing laws and spending government money, what are you going to give to? Well, it's going to be Alzheimer's. Your wife might be getting it, or husband. That's what the culture says. That's what they're going to spend money on, and they spent like $3 billion on it. Now, if you're a girl and you're looking at a life, it's far more likely that migraine is going to have a negative impact in your life than it is for a 60-year-old senator. But you don't vote on the Senate floor, you don't make the laws, and you don't spend our money, our country's money. And so, only $46 million go to NIH to fund migraine. So that's pretty bleak picture, and I don't want to depress you, but I do think that things are beginning to change. things are looking up. And it's a little bit of a feeling, but I ask you here, do you think that, 15 years ago, we could have gotten 700 people to come to Miles for Migraine? Do you think that, things have changed for people with migraine over the last few years? I think that they have, and I think that a lot of the people in this group are the ones who are making this enormous difference. We have some thoughts. Miles for Migraine, has some thoughts. We have programs designed to reduce stigma, as do many of the other migraine-related organizations, nonprofits. We talk about disclosure, like coming here to support migraine is an act of disclosure. It is a radical move supporting people with migraine and working against stigma. So thank you, everyone. The idea of an elevator speech, of coming out and being able to describe your condition and yourself and your struggle in a decent way, and show yourself with migraine, as whatever you are, but in a good way, a fighter, a person who endures, who's worked their way as best they can through all the junk that society is throwing at you, and despite your disease, is you. And that is your elevator speech. And figuring out how to respond when somebody says a stigmatizing thing. What are you going to say? How are you going to respond to that? Like, get ready for that. It's coming. And for doctors, I think, we're getting more doctors into headache medicine. We're making a difference. All of this is reducing the stigma of migraine, and it is really important. So thank you all for coming. And then I think that for doctors, one of the things, I've found in my job is, in a strange way, like, understanding about stigma gives me a competitive advantage over a doctor who doesn't get it. Like, there's a kind of jujitsu and a surprise factor when a patient comes in and they don't get stigmatized. And that's what I try to do in my practice, and I hope that, like, in your own, if you're a migraine patient, if you can do that mental jujitsu and, like, see yourself not in this kind of bad way that society has tried to make you see yourself, but instead, for the survivor, for the qualities that you have for trudging through. The Miles for Migraine logo comes from the Grateful Dead song, "Keep on Truckin'," with the big, the funny looking character with the skinny legs and the enormous shoes that keeps on trucking. And that's what y'all with migraine disease are doing. And thank you for trucking on over here. Thank you, everybody. I know I babbled too much. Thank you.